I was at a conference a couple weeks ago, and there's practitioners there from actually working in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I was giving this talk, and they said, no, you're being too harsh. We've built a road, right? We've done this. And I said, look, if you can show me somewhere where politicians that are goal in Afghanistan is to build a road, then I'll say, look, you've succeeded, right? You have succeeded. It's very similar to the foreign aid claims. We have no empirical evidence that foreign aid actually achieves its goal, which is stated by the proponents of foreign aid, to end poverty. The name of Jeff Sachs' book at Columbia University is The End of Poverty. It's not build a road, right? And yet they claim, they'll bust out anecdotal evidence of, well, it did this, it did that. It's like, okay, if we spend money on X, we get more of X. I agree, but we don't solve the economic problem of how to allocate resources or design the institutions which do that. So how do we do this? Well, one way to do it is smaller scale. Instead of thinking of the big picture of designing the entire country, let's focus on smaller scale reforms. I'm going to give you a specific example at the end. I'm going to give you an example in Iraq of something we can do that overcomes these traps, and I'm going to give you a kind of a bigger vision of how I think we should think about helping these countries. Broader reforms are possible, but we have to be careful about context-specific knowledge. And then there's this idea of planners versus searchers. And this idea comes from Bill Easterly, who's an economist at New York University. He runs the Development Research Institute. He has 2 books out, The Elusive Quest for Growth and The White Man's Burden. And basically he makes this important distinction between planners and searchers. And his argument in The White Man's Burden is that the development establishment is basically made up of planners. Basically, you get this development mentality, you can get a small group of people together. And if they're just the right group of people, you can write down the right plan and then implement it. And he says, look, really development comes from these searchers, local people, right? Who figure out what works and what doesn't work. Why do we like entrepreneurs so much? We like entrepreneurs because they find stuff out that you and I could have never thought of. Sure, they make mistakes all the time. That's why we like the loss part of profit and loss. It's a hard constraint on making mistakes. And it signals to them that you're doing the wrong thing. But it's the same logic with this. And here's the thing to think about. Development economics in general suffers from a Western bias, which is what we think works, we tend to think will work at other places. But we also know it's not that simple, because if it was, we wouldn't have to spend lots of money reconstructing Iraq and Afghanistan. We just need to go to a museum shop, buy the US Constitution for $5 and mail it over there. And then they say, look, just please utilize this Constitution, right? So there's this Western bias that what it does is basically it squelches the searchers. You come in and say, look, we're planning and telling you how to do it. And when this is the mentality that you have, you overlook the ability of ordinary citizens to figure stuff out. And it's much more likely to be sustainable over time when people discover what works on their own and adopts it. The third trap is the political economy trap. And here's the political economy trap. There is this view that pervades Reconstruction efforts that democracy is somehow the greatest thing ever. It's the romantic view of democracy, right? We need to bring democracy to them. And then when we get there, it's like, we got to hold elections, right? It's all about the elections. Well, guess what? Democracy by itself is not a good thing. It's not inherently good. And why? Well, democracy is a means of engaging in collective action, right? More specifically, collective decision-making. We have a group of people, we need to figure out what to do. Let's hold a majority vote. And then whoever has the majority will do that. Well, guess what? If you do that, it doesn't preclude the possibility of getting very bad outcomes. How would you like it if the majority won and then said, okay, we won, now we can turn around and kill the minority or do whatever we want to them? Most people would say, no, that's not what we mean by democracy. Typically what we mean when we talk about democracy is liberal or constitutional democracy, which is what? It's majority win, for instance, or whatever decision rule you pick, with constraints on the winners, such that they cannot abuse their power as winners against the losers. But here's the thing that becomes very difficult. What becomes very difficult is we're not very good, and when I say we, I mean social scientists, at designing constitutional rules to constrain the winners. We just don't have a good idea about how to go about doing that from scratch. So when we rush to have elections, it threatens the broader effort. It not only threatens potential harm, physical harm to people, but it threatens, for instance, imposing other things on people. Because here's the problem you run into. What happens if you allow people to vote and they vote for a different outcome than what you want? So you say, look, we're going to hold elections, but we also want a free market economy. And they vote and say, guess what, we don't want a free market economy. Now you have a choice. You can either violate self-determination and democratic outcomes and impose it on them, or you can go home, right? Typically we don't go home, at least not right away. So there's three problems with the political economy trap. The first is, like I mentioned, it neglects the potential costs of democracy. Democracy by itself is not inherently good. It does not guarantee benefits. We have many examples of people abusing democratic power and imposing significant costs on people. That doesn't mean it always happens, but we can't ex ante assume a romantic view of democracy, that somehow it's good in itself and just holding elections will somehow generate the outcomes that we want them to generate. As I mentioned, there can be a trade-off, right? This is the democracy economic or democracy legal trade-off, which means if you put democracy as the ultimate end and you have elections and that's it, well then you better be ready for the potential outcome, which may run counter to your other plans. And finally, it neglects the status quo. It neglects the fact, for instance, that most of these countries, again, we call them weak and failed states for a reason, don't have well-functioning political institutions. So simply electing someone and saying, now you run the government, right, please reform it, is most likely not going to get the outcome you want. There's the phrase, a culture of corruption, for a reason. It's embedded, it's part of the culture, that's part of the status quo. So holding an election doesn't overcome a culture of corruption. Right? It simply puts someone else in power with the same existing culture of corruption, which has been a major problem in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Right? In Iraq, we went in the coalitional provisional authority. All right? Again, this should get a laugh because it's true. They issue 100 orders. We're designing the economy, we're designing the country, 100 orders, right, to start our designing it. Here, I'm going to write them down. They're very short. You can pull them up. They're online. They're like half a page long. The first one, of course, is de-Baathification. They get rid of everyone in the Ba'athist Party. Now, you can see why they did this, right? Because they wanted to cleanse the system of basically Saddam Hussein's party. But here's the problem you had. It ignored the status quo, which is, guess what Iraq was? It was a huge rent-seeking society. It was basically different bureaucracies set up that controlled different parts of the country. People had their friends here and there and their family members. They got wealthy from it. Some got wealthy, some remained poor. But that's how you made your livelihood. But now you've kicked most of those people out. But simultaneously, the Coalition Provisional Authority says, we don't want to rebuild the government from scratch. We want to utilize existing government agencies. But now they had no one to run them. So actually, corruption increased because there was always a check in Iraq on corruption, which was Saddam Hussein's secret police. And here was the thing. You wanted to be corrupt and make as much money as you can, but not too much. Because if they saw you making too much money, it would raise eyebrows. You don't want to raise eyebrows when you can get blackbagged in the middle of the night and disappear, right? Which is basically what happened, right? If they didn't like you, you disappear in the middle of the night and no one would ever see you again. So that was an inherent check on corruption. It's a kind of a weird way to think about it, but that's what happened. But now all those checks were gone because we kicked all these people out. And basically, corruption ran rampant. I'm going to give you an example of this in a couple moments. So how do you avoid the political economy trap? Well, we have to make some tough decisions. One is to pick one. Say, no matter what, we're going with politics. Democracy is our ultimate. I value that the most. People talk about it as if this is true, right? They say democracy, that's the ultimate. Well, then hold elections, and that's the end of it, right? And if it runs counter to the other stuff we want to do, so be it. But you better be careful to think about and recognize this trade-off. And recognize that some goals you just can't, they're not compatible. If you're focusing on efficiency, for instance, that necessarily precludes having equal incomes for everyone, right? So certain trade-offs exist, and we have to understand that. Again, a basic economic principle, trade-offs, right? Many times we pretend like they don't exist, right? We can have our cake and eat it too. And finally, appreciate the status quo. Let's not pretend as if simply holding elections or democracy is the end-all and be-all. Finally, the bureaucracy trap. The bureaucracy trap is the over-reliance on bureaucracy. Bureaucracies basically pervade reconstruction efforts. If you look up the list of government and international agencies and bureaus involved in Iraq and Afghanistan and other reconstruction efforts, they're staggering. Staggering. I mean, there's tons of them. There's bureaucrats running around doing everything. They come up with plans, they design the plans, they oversee the plans. Now, here's a rule of thumb for you. Pull up any government report on a failed government program, and I guarantee you'll see the following. Well, they'll never say, the problem must be over-reliance on bureaucracy. They're going to say, we need better planning and better coordination. If only we had planned better and coordinated better with other bureaus, it would have been different.